The courtroom was thick with tension. Judge Richard Callaway, an older man with sharp features, adjusted his glasses, scanning the room. The air felt heavy, suffocating. Everyone was waiting for his ruling. The gavel was poised in his hand, but before he could speak, a small voice interrupted the silence. "Your Honor," a young girl's voice piped up. Emily, no older than 9, stood at the back of the courtroom, her blonde curls bouncing as she stepped forward. Her blue eyes were wide with determination. Though small in stature, her presence felt enormous in the room. Her hands were clenched into fists, and she wasn't backing down. "Emily, sit down," her mother, Jessica, hissed from her seat at the defense table. Her voice cracked with panic. But Emily didn't listen. She couldn't. This was her moment. "I need to say something," Emily said, her voice shaking but clear. The whole courtroom fell silent, all eyes on her. The defense attorney, stunned, stared at the little girl. Even the prosecutor's eyes widened, and Jessica reached out in desperation to pull Emily back. But it was too late. "Let her speak," Judge Callaway said calmly, his voice cutting through the tension. He gestured for everyone to remain silent, his gaze focused on Emily. Her breath caught in her throat, but she held her ground. She raised her chin, her eyes now locked on the judge. "You can't punish my mommy," she said, her voice steady. "She didn't do it." Gasps spread across the room. The spectators murmured in confusion. The defense attorney looked at Jessica with wide eyes, his jaw dropped. Even the prosecutor seemed rattled by Emily's declaration. The judge, however, took a deep breath and motioned for the proceedings to continue. "Emily, sit down." Jessica's voice was louder now, almost frantic. But Emily didn't sit. She took a step forward, her finger pointing firmly toward a man seated in the back of the room. "I know who did it," she said, her voice clear as day. "It wasn't my mom. It was him." The room froze. Every eye shifted to the man she was pointing to, Brian Reynolds, the businessman who had testified against Jessica, claiming he saw her at the crime scene. His face drained of color as he realized Emily was accusing him. His eyes flicked toward the door. Before anyone could react, Reynolds bolted from his seat, rushing for the exit. The crowd gasped. The bailiff tried to intercept him, but the judge raised his hand. "Let him go," Judge Callaway ordered. Reynolds reached the door, but the bailiffs were too quick. They tackled him just before he could escape. Papers flew everywhere. The reporters scrambled to capture every moment. Emily didn't flinch. She simply stood there, small but unshaken. She had just saved her mother's life. 2 months earlier, Emily had never imagined she would step foot inside a courtroom. Her life had been simple, full of bedtime stories and school days. But everything changed the night the police came to their door. It was late, past Emily's bedtime, when the pounding at the door startled her awake. She rubbed her eyes, groggy from sleep, and stumbled out of bed. The lights in the living room were on, and she could hear her mother talking to someone in the kitchen. Then came the loud knock again. "Open up! Police!" came the shout. Emily's heart began to race. She peeked around the corner just as her mother opened the door. Jessica's face was filled with confusion. Before she could react, 3 officers stormed in, their footsteps heavy. "Jessica Carter," one officer said in a commanding tone. Jessica blinked, her face pale. "What's going on?" "You're under arrest for the murder of Daniel Thompson," the officer declared. Emily's blood ran cold. She had never heard that name before. "Murder?" she whispered. No, there's been a mistake," Jessica protested. "I don't even know anyone named Daniel Thompson." The officers weren't listening. They grabbed her arms, pulling them behind her back. Emily screamed, running forward to grab her mother's hand. "Mommy, don't go," she cried. "Emily, listen to me," Jessica said, her voice trembling but calm. "Stay strong, baby. I'll fix this." The officers pulled Jessica away. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving the apartment in silence. Emily stood frozen, tears welling in her eyes. Her mother was gone. The following days were a blur. Emily stayed with Mrs. Roberts, their elderly neighbor, but it never felt right. Every morning, Emily hoped she'd wake up to find her mother making breakfast in the kitchen. But every day, the kitchen stayed empty. At school, the whispers started. "Did you hear about the woman accused of murder?" some of the kids said. Some said Jessica did it. Others said she didn't. Emily didn't care what they thought. She knew her mother was innocent, and she was determined to prove it. Emily began paying close attention to the news. She watched every broadcast and listened carefully. One name kept coming up: Brian Reynolds, a businessman who had claimed to have seen Jessica at the crime scene. But something about him didn't sit right with Emily. She started to remember where she had seen him before: her mother's office. It was a small room filled with legal papers from her job as a legal assistant. Jessica had always told Emily not to go in there. But one afternoon, when Mrs. Roberts was napping, Emily couldn't resist. She snuck into the office and began going through the files. That's when she found it: a client file. The picture inside was of Brian Reynolds. Her hands shook as she stared at the photo. He had lied. Her mother knew him. This wasn't over. Emily had to find out the truth. 2 months had passed since Emily's mother, Jessica, was arrested. But Emily's life had never been the same. She had been forced to stay with Mrs. Roberts, their elderly neighbor, whose home was kind but never felt like home. Every night, Emily would lay in Mrs. Roberts's guest room, her mind racing with thoughts of her mother behind bars and the cold, empty apartment she had once shared with her. Mrs. Roberts would try to comfort Emily, but she could see the sadness in the old woman's eyes, too. It was hard for Emily to believe that her mother, who always tucked her in at night and kissed her forehead, was suddenly accused of something so terrible. At school, whispers spread like wildfire. Emily ignored most of it. Some kids claimed they saw the news. Woman accused of murder. Some said Jessica had done it. Others argued she was innocent. It didn't matter to Emily what anyone else believed. She knew the truth. Her mother would never hurt anyone. Still, the days passed slowly. When Emily wasn't at school or staying with Mrs. Roberts, she would often hide in the small corner of their apartment, trying to feel close to her mother. There, she would sift through papers, her mind racing through all the clues she could find. Jessica had always worked with legal files, assisting a law firm. Emily remembered her mother mentioning a client named Brian Reynolds before, a businessman with an unsettling presence. It wasn't until she started piecing things together that Emily realized Brian was lying. He was the key to unraveling the truth. Emily couldn't shake the memory of the picture she had found in her mother's office. Brian Reynolds, a man she had only heard about, was sitting there in the file, looking all too familiar. He had been one of her mother's clients, yet, in court, he had denied knowing her. This wasn't just a small lie. It felt like the crack in a larger conspiracy. But Emily didn't know where to start. She was just a kid. She couldn't solve this on her own, no matter how much she wanted to. But she had one thing her mother didn't have: a clear mind. Jessica was locked away, waiting for a trial. But Emily could still dig for answers. So she did. On the morning of the trial, Emily was sitting in the back of the courtroom. She had begged Mrs. Roberts to take her there, hoping to see her mother again. She wasn't sure what to expect. Jessica was sitting at the defense table looking exhausted. Her once confident demeanor had faded into worry and fear. She had been through so much already. But when Emily's eyes met hers across the room, Jessica managed a weak smile. Emily clenched her fists. She had to find a way to help her mother. But it wasn't until the moment Emily stood up in the courtroom and pointed to Brian Reynolds, accusing him of being the real culprit, that everything changed. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The prosecutors were stunned. The defense team was scrambling, and the judge didn't know what to do. In that moment, Emily had made a difference. She had taken control, something she never expected to do. But as the police tackled Brian and the chaos settled, Emily felt a strange mix of relief and fear. She had done something good, but now what? Would this really be enough to prove her mother's innocence? After the trial, Emily was allowed to visit her mother. Jessica was sitting in the small visitor's room, her eyes red from crying. But when Emily ran to her, Jessica stood and embraced her tightly. "You did it, sweetheart," she whispered. "You saved me." Emily felt her heart swell. It was the first time she felt like her actions truly mattered. But the fear wasn't gone. Not yet. Emily could feel it deep in her gut. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. A few days later, Emily sat in Mrs. Roberts's living room, listening to the news about Brian Reynolds. The news coverage was vague. He had been arrested. But there was no real explanation about what had happened. Emily knew better. There was something strange about it all. She couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't been acting alone. If anything, he was just a pawn in something much bigger. Her suspicions were confirmed when she overheard Jessica and her lawyer, Rachel, talking late one night. Emily had been lying in bed, unable to sleep, when she heard her mother's voice from the other room. "Rachel, what do you think happened to Brian? Why did he run?" "I don't know, Jessica," Rachel replied, "but whoever's behind this is powerful. They're not done with you." The words echoed in Emily's mind, and she realized that her mother was right to be afraid. Brian Reynolds wasn't the mastermind. He was a tool in someone else's game. Someone bigger, someone more dangerous. The next day, Emily went to the library. She had learned about a man named Michael Callaway in the news. He was a powerful businessman with connections everywhere. Emily wasn't sure how he fit into the puzzle, but she had a feeling he was involved somehow. She spent hours scouring old articles, looking for any link between him and her mother. Finally, she found it. Callaway was one of her mother's old clients, and according to a news report from a few years back, he had been tied to a scandal involving fraud. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. There was something about this man that unsettled her, and now she knew. He had ties to the very case that had ruined her family. With this new information, Emily felt a growing sense of urgency. There was more to this story than anyone realized. She couldn't let her mother stay in jail, not when there was someone pulling the strings from behind the scenes. She had to dig deeper, find more answers. It wasn't just about proving her mother's innocence. It was about exposing the truth. Emily sat in the quiet corner of Mrs. Roberts's living room, her mind racing. She had just discovered a name: Michael Callaway, the powerful businessman who had been tied to Jessica's past and to the mysterious case surrounding Daniel Thompson's murder. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Callaway was at the center of everything that had happened. There had to be more to it than just a simple case of wrongful arrest. She didn't know where to start, but Emily had one advantage that no one else did. She was small, unnoticed, and most importantly, she was free to move around without suspicion. While the adults in her life were bogged down with lawyers, court hearings, and the constant weight of the case, Emily was determined to take matters into her own hands. She had to find the truth, even if it meant digging into places she shouldn't be. For the next few days, Emily spent every free moment she could find looking into Michael Callaway. She was meticulous, writing down notes and memorizing articles. Callaway was a businessman who had risen to the top of the city's corporate world, his name associated with powerful people, politicians, police officers, and lawyers. He was untouchable, and that's exactly why Emily was so sure he had something to do with her mother's arrest. One afternoon, when Mrs. Roberts was out grocery shopping, Emily decided to take a bold step. She was going to search her mother's office again. She knew her mom had kept important files in there, and she was certain there was something connecting Callaway to her mother's wrongful arrest. She had already found the client file with Brian Reynolds's picture, but there had to be more. Sneaking into the office, Emily quickly sifted through the papers on her mother's desk. It felt strange to be in this room again, knowing her mother was still sitting in a cell. The desk was organized, but everything had a strange air of abandonment now. The pens and papers felt out of place, without her mother's warm hands around them. Emily turned her attention to the file cabinet, sliding the drawer open slowly. She began pulling out file after file, client documents, legal forms, old case files. She flipped through them quickly, her heart pounding. Then she came across a familiar name, Michael Callaway. There, in front of her, was a thick file labeled with his name. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Opening the file, she found several documents, a collection of contracts, financial papers, and a series of confidential meetings between Jessica and Callaway's legal team. The deeper she dug, the more she realized the depth of Callaway's reach. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a puppet master, pulling the strings in countless shady dealings. Her mother had been working for him, and from the looks of these papers, it wasn't just about the law. There were deals happening in the shadows, illegal activities, bribes, and connections to some of the city's most powerful figures. But there was one paper in particular that made Emily's heart race. It was a contract signed by both Jessica and Michael Callaway, dated just a few weeks before her mother's arrest. The contract detailed a large financial transaction, one that Emily knew had to be illegal. It was a deal that involved Daniel Thompson, the man who had been murdered, but the document offered no explanation about the circumstances. The deal seemed far too shady, far too dangerous. Emily's mind was reeling as she closed the file and stuffed it into her backpack. She knew she needed to act quickly. This was the key to proving her mother's innocence, and yet she felt a strange sense of dread. Callaway was dangerous, and the deeper she dug, the more she realized just how deep the corruption went. That evening, Emily snuck out of Mrs. Roberts's house, determined to take the file to someone who could help. She needed someone who could understand what she had found, someone who could help her put all the pieces together. After hours of walking through the darkened streets, she reached the office of her mother's lawyer, Rachel. She had been in touch with Rachel before, but Emily had always stayed in the background, listening as her mother discussed the case. Tonight, however, Emily had something to offer, a clue that could potentially clear her mother's name. She knocked on the door. Rachel opened it with a surprised look on her face. "Emily? What are you doing here?" Rachel asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. "I need to talk to you," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. She stepped inside and pulled the file from her backpack, handing it to Rachel. "I found something. Something important." Rachel took the file, her eyes scanning it quickly. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice suddenly tight. "I found it in Mom's office," Emily replied, watching Rachel's face closely. Rachel flipped through the papers, her expression shifting as she read. This is huge, Emily," she said, her voice thick with disbelief. "Do you know what this means?" Emily nodded, feeling a weight lift off her chest. "I think it proves Mom is innocent," she said, her heart pounding. "But I need help. I don't know what to do with this." Rachel stood up, pacing the room. "This could be the breakthrough we've been looking for," she said, a hint of excitement in her voice. "But it's dangerous, Emily. You've found something big, and Callaway won't let this slip easily." Emily felt a cold chill settle over her. "What do we do now?" she asked. Rachel turned to her, her face serious. "We need to make sure we're prepared, and we need to act fast. This could be the key to everything." As Rachel began making calls, Emily sat quietly, her mind racing. She had taken the first step in unraveling the truth, but she couldn't do it alone. Not anymore. There were forces at play far beyond her control, and if she wasn't careful, she could find herself in a world of trouble. The next few days felt like a blur to Emily. The moment she had handed over the file to Rachel, things had started to happen faster than she could process. Rachel had promised to take the evidence to her colleagues, but she warned Emily to stay out of the way. "It's too dangerous," Rachel had said. "You've already done your part. Now let us handle it." But Emily wasn't about to sit back. She couldn't. She had seen what was at stake. Her mother's freedom, her family's future, depended on the secrets she had uncovered. And Emily wasn't going to let that slip through her fingers. Not now. Not when she was so close. After school the next day, Emily decided to go back to the apartment. Mrs. Roberts wasn't home, and Emily had the house to herself for a few hours. She wasn't sure why, but she felt the urge to go back to her mother's office. Something was calling her there. Maybe it was the last lingering trace of her mother's presence, or maybe it was just the need for answers. She entered the apartment carefully, her eyes darting around the familiar space. It felt strange now, so empty and quiet without her mother. The walls that had once been filled with laughter and warmth were now eerily silent. Walking to the small corner of the apartment, Emily paused outside the door to her mother's office. She had already searched through most of it, but there was something about that file, something she hadn't fully understood yet. Maybe there was more. She needed to be sure. She took a deep breath and opened the door. The room smelled faintly of paper and dust. Her mother's desk stood in the middle, papers scattered across it, like they had been left in a hurry. Emily sat down at the desk and began to sort through the papers. She carefully flipped through the files, looking for anything that could offer more information about Michael Callaway or Brian Reynolds. As she shuffled through a pile of old case files, one document caught her eye. It wasn't a legal form or a client file. It was a small envelope tucked behind a stack of papers. Emily pulled it out, her heart racing. The envelope was sealed, the ink on it smudged from years of being hidden away. She opened it carefully, her fingers trembling as she pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a letter, handwritten, but the words seemed to blur at first. Emily squinted and read aloud under her breath. "Daniel Thompson's death. Necessary. Cover-up." Her stomach churned. She kept reading. The letter was filled with cryptic phrases and vague threats, but the message was clear. Someone had planned Daniel Thompson's murder. And Jessica, unknowingly, had been caught in the crossfire. She had been used to cover up a larger conspiracy. The more Emily read, the more she realized that her mother had been involved with forces far beyond what she had ever known. The letter spoke of cleaning up loose ends and ensuring the silence of witnesses. It was as if her mother had been drawn into something much darker than she could have ever imagined. And the more Emily uncovered, the more she realized just how much danger they were all in. Her pulse quickened as the weight of the situation hit her. This was it. The proof she had been looking for. The letter clearly tied Michael Callaway to Daniel Thompson's death. confirming everything Emily had feared. But there was more. The letter also mentioned a meeting that was supposed to take place, where all of this would be settled once and for all. Emily quickly folded the letter and stuffed it into her pocket. She needed to get out of there, fast. She didn't know how much time she had before someone realized the letter was missing, or worse, before Callaway's men came looking for it. She was just about to leave the office when she heard the sound of footsteps outside the apartment door. Emily froze. She quickly stuffed the letter back into her backpack and stood silently, her heart hammering in her chest. She tiptoed to the window and peeked through the blinds. Outside, she saw a black SUV parked across the street. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the vehicle. It had been there before, watching the apartment, following her every move. She hadn't seen it since the night of her mother's arrest, but now it was back. Emily's stomach tightened. Someone was watching them. And if they knew she was here, they wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to get the evidence back. She grabbed her backpack, zipped it up, and made her way quietly to the back door. Her mind raced with options. She couldn't go to the police. Not yet. She needed to get the evidence to Rachel, to someone who could make sense of it. But how? The SUV outside was the least of her worries. The real danger was the people behind all of this. They were everywhere. Emily slipped out the back door of the apartment building and hurried down the alley, her footsteps muffled against the pavement. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel their eyes on her, every step, every breath. As she reached the end of the alley, she glanced up to see a figure standing across the street. He was tall, wearing a black coat, and his face was shadowed by the streetlight. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't make out his features, but the way he stood, motionless and watching, sent a chill down her spine. He wasn't just anyone. He was one of them. Her instincts told her to keep moving. She didn't know how much longer she had before they caught up with her, but Emily wasn't going to stop. Not now. She had the proof. She had the power to end this. She ran, faster now, determined to get to Rachel. The stakes had never been higher. Emily's heart raced as she ran down the alley, her footsteps echoing off the walls. The cold air cut through her, but she hardly noticed. She couldn't afford to stop. She had to get the letter to Rachel. She had to make sure the truth came out. The black SUV was still parked across the street. The man standing by it hadn't moved. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. He was watching her, and somehow she knew it wasn't just a coincidence. She wasn't paranoid. She was being hunted. She turned a corner quickly, hoping to lose him in the maze of alleyways. She had learned to stay hidden, to be quiet. But this time, there was no time for caution. She had to move fast. Her breath came in short bursts as she continued running. She could see the faint outline of Rachel's office building in the distance. If she could just make it there, she would be safe. Rachel could help. She had to help. When Emily reached the building, she slipped through the back door and into the dimly lit hallway. Her hands shook as she fumbled for the key to the office. The fear was overwhelming now, but she tried to focus. She had the evidence. She had to keep it safe. The door clicked open, and Emily stepped inside. Rachel was sitting at her desk, her back turned to the door. When she heard Emily's hurried footsteps, she spun around. "Emily, what are you doing here?" Rachel asked, her voice laced with surprise and concern. "I found something," Emily said, holding up the folder with the letter. "I found out who did it, Rachel. It's Michael Callaway. He's the one behind it all." Rachel's eyes widened as she stood up. She took the folder from Emily's trembling hands and flipped through the letter. This is huge, Emily," she whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. "You've really done it. You've found the proof we needed." Emily nodded, her body still tense with the adrenaline of her escape. "I don't know how much time we have," she said, glancing over her shoulder nervously. "There's a guy outside, watching. He's one of Callaway's men. He must have followed me here." Rachel's face hardened. "We need to move quickly. If Callaway knows we have this, we're not safe here." Rachel locked the office door and began gathering papers, shuffling through them with purpose. Emily watched her, her mind still spinning. She couldn't believe it. She had finally done it. She had found the truth. And now they had the proof to clear her mother's name. "We need to take this to the authorities," Rachel said, her voice resolute. "I have a contact who can help us, someone on the inside." Before Emily could respond, there was a knock at the door. Rachel froze, her eyes narrowing. "Stay quiet," she whispered, motioning for Emily to hide behind the desk. "Stay down. Don't move." Emily crouched low behind the desk, trying to calm her racing heart. She could hear the door handle turn softly. The tension in the air was unbearable. The door creaked open, and Emily peeked through a small crack in the desk. Standing in the doorway was a tall figure, wearing a dark suit. It wasn't one of Callaway's men, but it wasn't someone Rachel knew either. "Can I help you?" Rachel asked, her voice sharp but controlled. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just here to make sure everything's in order," he said smoothly. "A little birdie told me you were working on something important, Miss Carter. We wouldn't want anything to happen to your evidence, would we?" Rachel's face remained neutral. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped further into the office, his eyes scanning the room with purpose. Emily could feel her heart in her throat. Who was this man? What did he want? The man stopped at the desk, his gaze landing on the folder Rachel had just opened. Emily's breath hitched. Without another word, the man turned and walked out of the office, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. "Who was that?" Emily whispered from behind the desk, her voice trembling. Rachel waited until the sound of footsteps faded before standing up. "That was one of Callaway's people," she said quietly. "I don't know how they found us, but I do know they're trying to stop us. They'll do anything to make sure we don't expose what they've done." Emily's stomach sank. What now? What do we do? Rachel looked at her with determination in her eyes. "We take the next step. We get this to the right people. People who can protect us." The weight of the situation pressed down on Emily's shoulders, but she didn't flinch. They had the truth now, and nothing, not even Callaway's men, could take it away. As Rachel made the call to her contact, Emily sat quietly, holding her breath. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes now. Her mother's future depended on this. Later that day, Rachel and Emily made their way to the courthouse. They had arranged a meeting with a trusted detective who could help them expose Michael Callaway's operation. But Emily could feel the danger all around them. They weren't just walking into a courtroom. They were walking into the lion's den. As they entered the building, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The corridors echoed with the sound of hurried footsteps, the hum of busy lawyers and reporters buzzing around. Emily clutched Rachel's arm, her heart pounding in her chest. When they reached the courtroom, Emily took a seat at the back. Her mother was already there, sitting with her defense attorney. Emily's heart clenched as she saw Jessica. Her mother looked tired, worn down by the long months of this fight. But when their eyes met, Jessica smiled softly. Emily's heart swelled with a mixture of hope and fear. The trial was about to resume, but Emily knew it wasn't just the trial that would change things. The truth, what they had uncovered, was going to turn everything upside down. The courtroom was filled with an air of anticipation as Emily sat in the back, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her mother, Jessica, was seated at the defense table, her eyes scanning the room. Jessica looked worn, her face pale, but her determination was evident. Emily could see that she had been through so much. Months of uncertainty, a life turned upside down. But Jessica still held on to the hope that the truth would set her free. But Emily's stomach twisted with a growing unease. Even after everything she had uncovered, she knew this was just the beginning. The evidence they had found, the letter linking Michael Callaway to the murder of Daniel Thompson, was huge. But it wasn't enough. Callaway had too many powerful connections. He had the law, the police, and politicians in his pocket. Emily had seen the way they tried to silence her mother, and she knew that it wasn't over yet. They hadn't won, not by a long shot. Rachel had promised to bring the information to the right people, but Emily didn't trust anyone in this fight anymore. She couldn't afford to. The more she learned, the more she realized how deep the conspiracy went. Callaway wasn't just a corrupt businessman. He was at the center of an entire web of corruption, and Jessica had unknowingly stepped into it. As the trial continued, Emily's thoughts kept racing. She glanced at the prosecutor's table and noticed the way the prosecutor, David Holloway, seemed unfazed by the new evidence that had been introduced. His posture was relaxed, as though he knew something the rest of them didn't. Emily could feel it in the air. Holloway was more than just a prosecutor. He was part of something bigger. The court recessed for a brief break, and Emily couldn't sit still. She needed to talk to Rachel. She needed to understand what was going on behind the scenes. Rachel had been working with a detective, someone who could help expose Callaway's connections, but Emily had a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. There was a deeper layer to this conspiracy, and she wasn't sure anyone was really prepared to go all the way. She slipped out of her seat and made her way toward the hallway, hoping to find Rachel. She spotted her just outside the courtroom, speaking to someone in a hushed tone. The detective she had been working with, Detective Thompson, was standing beside her. He was tall, with graying hair and a tired expression. But when he saw Emily, his face hardened slightly, as if he had just realized she had overheard something she shouldn't have. "Emily," Rachel said, her voice low but firm, "I need you to stay back for a minute, okay? This is too dangerous." Emily's heart pounded. She couldn't wait any longer. "I heard something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I overheard the prosecutor. He's not who he says he is, Rachel. He's connected to Callaway. I know it." Rachel looked at her sharply, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice cautious. "I've been watching him," Emily said, trying to calm her nerves. "He's too calm. He's acting like he's already won. He's part of the cover-up." Rachel's eyes widened in disbelief. She opened her mouth to respond, but Detective Thompson stepped forward, shaking his head. "You don't know what you're getting into," he said quietly, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. "This is bigger than you think." Emily's heart raced. "I know," she said, her voice shaking. "But my mom is innocent, and I'm not going to let Callaway and his people get away with it." Rachel hesitated for a moment, then gave a nod. "You're right," she said softly. "We need to act fast. If Holloway is working with Callaway, then we've got a bigger problem on our hands." Thompson stepped back. "We need to move quickly. Get back to the office. I've got something I need to show you." Emily didn't ask questions. She followed Rachel and Detective Thompson out of the courthouse and into the car. The drive felt like it took forever, the city streets blurring past her. She couldn't stop thinking about what she had overheard. Holloway was involved. He was working with Callaway to make sure her mother stayed behind bars, no matter what. Emily had to find a way to expose him, and fast. When they arrived at the office, Thompson led them to a back room where a stack of documents sat on the table. He gestured for Emily to sit down. "These are the records I've been able to dig up," he said, opening the first folder. "Callaway's influence runs deep. Holloway isn't the only one on his payroll. We've found links between him and several city officials, including some of the top police officers. He's been pulling the strings for years." Emily felt the weight of the documents in her hands. This was the evidence they needed, but it was also the evidence that would put their lives in danger. Callaway wouldn't stop until they were silenced. She glanced at Rachel. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "We take it public," Rachel said, her tone resolute. "We expose Callaway. We make sure this information gets to the right people, people who can't be bought." Emily nodded, feeling a sense of urgency rise in her chest. They couldn't wait any longer. Callaway had already tried to silence them once before. This time, they would be ready. As they prepared to release the information, Emily couldn't help but think about her mother. Jessica had been caught in a web of lies and deceit, and now Emily had the power to untangle it. But she knew this was just the beginning. The real battle was about to begin. But for the first time in months, Emily felt a flicker of hope. They were going to fight back, and they wouldn't stop until they had exposed the truth. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she followed Rachel and Detective Thompson into the back room of the office. The stack of documents Thompson had laid out was overwhelming. Pages upon pages of evidence, connections, and deals that reached far beyond what Emily had ever imagined. She had known Michael Callaway was dangerous, but seeing everything laid out in front of her, the full extent of his power and influence, was enough to make her stomach churn. Rachel was already on the phone, making arrangements to send the files to the proper authorities, but Emily couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. They had the truth now. They knew who was behind her mother's wrongful arrest, who had orchestrated the entire thing, but the real question was, would anyone believe them? Would the authorities do anything to stop Callaway? Or would they protect him like they had done with everyone else in his orbit? "We're running out of time," Thompson said, his voice grim. "Callaway won't let this go. He's got too much to lose. If he finds out we're moving on him, he'll come after all of us." The gravity of his words settled over Emily like a heavy weight. She had always known they were in danger, but now it felt real. They weren't just fighting for justice anymore. They were fighting for their lives. Rachel hung up the phone and turned to Emily. "We have to move fast. We've got a secure channel to release the information, but I'm not sure how long we've got before Callaway's people find out. We need to keep a low profile, stay off the radar." Emily nodded, her mind racing. The thought of putting her mother's life and their own in even more danger was terrifying. But she knew they had no other choice. This wasn't just about proving her mother's innocence anymore. It was about stopping a dangerous man from continuing his reign of terror. As they were discussing their next move, there was a sudden crash from the front of the building, loud, jarring. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, fast and heavy. Emily's heart leaped into her throat. "Get down!" Thompson hissed, grabbing Emily by the arm and pulling her to the floor. He was already reaching for his gun. Rachel quickly turned off the lights, plunging the room into darkness. They huddled together, listening intently to the footsteps growing louder. Emily's mind raced, but her body was frozen with fear. She had seen the power Callaway wielded before. His men were ruthless, and they wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to keep the truth from coming out. Thompson moved quietly to the door, his hand on the handle. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice low. He cracked the door open just enough to peer outside, his eyes scanning the hallway. Emily held her breath. The seconds felt like hours. The footsteps were now directly outside the office door. Someone was coming. Thompson looked back at them, his face tense. "We've got company," he muttered. "I'll distract them. You two get to the back exit. Move fast. Stay quiet." Emily didn't want to leave him. Thompson had been their protector through this entire ordeal, but she knew he was right. The danger wasn't just coming for him. It was coming for all of them. Rachel gave a quick nod, and together they crept toward the back door. Emily's pulse raced as she tried to stay as quiet as possible. Every movement felt amplified in the silence. Her mind kept flashing to her mother. Was she okay? What if Callaway was already on his way to the courthouse? What if they had no time to stop him? The door creaked open, and Emily's eyes scanned the dark alley outside. It was quiet, but not for long. She could hear the faint sound of voices approaching from the front of the building. "We can't go back to the apartment," Rachel whispered urgently. "They'll be watching it. We need to get to a safe house." Emily didn't need to be told twice. She trusted Rachel completely, and right now she had no choice but to follow her lead. Together, they moved quickly down the alley, staying low to avoid detection. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. As they turned the corner, Emily looked over her shoulder and spotted a dark figure standing in the distance, watching them from the shadows. The man's face was obscured, but Emily knew without a doubt that he was one of Callaway's men. They had been spotted. "Go faster!" Rachel hissed, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her down a narrow side street. They ran as fast as they could, but Emily's mind was racing with fear. She couldn't think of anything other than the man who had been watching them. Was he the only one? Or were there more? Was Callaway already onto them? They finally reached the safe house, an old building on the outskirts of the city. Rachel's contact was waiting for them. He was a grizzled man in his 50s, with a rough, weathered look that spoke of a life spent in dangerous places. "You two need to stay here until I get word from my people," the man said gruffly, eyeing the alley behind them. "Callaway's not going to give up easily. You've stirred the hornet's nest." Emily nodded, her breath still shaky from running. She wasn't sure what to expect next, but one thing was clear. This fight was far from over. They had exposed Callaway, but now they were facing his wrath. Emily's mind kept racing back to her mother. Was she safe? How much longer would it take before they could bring this all to an end? As they stepped into the safe house and the door closed behind them, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The darkness outside felt heavier, as though the world had grown more dangerous in a single moment. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She had to keep moving. She had to finish what she had started. The safe house felt suffocating. The walls, once a source of safety, now felt like a trap. Emily paced the small room, her mind swirling with 100 thoughts. Every minute that passed, she felt the walls closing in on her. Callaway was still out there, and so were his men. Rachel had been working tirelessly with her contact, but even with their help, the looming danger seemed impossible to escape. They had exposed the truth, but it was clear that Callaway wasn't going down without a fight. "He's not going to stop," Rachel said, her voice tired but steady as she sat at the table, looking through the stack of papers they had sent to the authorities. "He has too much power, too many people working for him." Emily nodded, her eyes darting toward the window. It was late in the evening, but she couldn't seem to settle. Her mind kept racing back to the courtroom. Her mother, Jessica, was still out there, still waiting for justice. Every second felt like a lifetime. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? Rachel motioned for Emily to stay back as she went to answer it. The door creaked open, revealing Detective Thompson, his face grim and worn. "We have a problem," Thompson said, stepping inside quickly, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to follow. Emily's stomach dropped. "What happened?" she asked, her voice shaky. Thompson closed the door behind him and sighed. "It's Callaway. He knows we have the evidence, and he's moving fast. I've been following his tracks, but he's already cleaned up his mess. We're running out of time. We need to get to the courthouse. If we don't act now, everything we've done will be for nothing." Rachel stood up quickly, her eyes meeting Emily's with a look that said everything. It was time to end this, once and for all. "We can't go back there," Rachel said, shaking her head. "Callaway's people will be watching every move we make." Thompson's expression darkened. "We don't have a choice. This is bigger than just us now. If Callaway gets away with this, we're all done for. You want to make sure he's taken down? You have to go to the one place he can't hide, straight into the lion's den." Rachel hesitated, but then nodded. "Fine. Let's go." Emily felt a mixture of fear and determination. This was it. The moment everything changed. She had been fighting for so long to clear her mother's name, to bring down the corrupt system that had wrongfully accused her. But now it was all coming down to this final confrontation. Could they really bring down someone as powerful as Callaway? They left the safe house, moving quickly and quietly. Emily kept her head down, following Rachel and Thompson as they weaved through the dark streets. Every corner, every shadow felt like it could hide an enemy. Emily's eyes scanned the surroundings, her instincts screaming that they weren't alone. She could feel it, the threat closing in. When they reached the courthouse, it was eerily quiet. The doors were locked, and there was no sign of life. Emily glanced up at the building, her heart racing. This was where it would all come to a head. Callaway knew they were coming for him. But this time, it wasn't just about proving the truth. It was about survival. Thompson led the way, his hand resting on the holster at his waist. "Stay close," he warned, his voice low. "We can't afford any mistakes." They entered the building through the back entrance, careful not to draw attention. Every step felt heavy with the weight of what was at stake. The closer they got to the main courtroom, the more Emily's chest tightened. She kept thinking about her mother, about the long months of waiting, of the uncertainty and fear Jessica had endured. They were finally about to end it. But the moment they reached the courtroom doors, everything changed. The doors slammed open. Standing in front of them was a group of men, Callaway's men. They were armed and ready. One of them, a tall, cold-eyed figure, stepped forward. "You think you can stop this?" he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "You should have stayed out of this, Rachel. And you," he said, turning to Emily, "you're just a child. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Thompson drew his gun, his eyes hard with resolve. "Step aside," he warned. "We're not going anywhere until Callaway pays for what he's done." The man laughed. "It's too late for that. He's already made arrangements. No one gets to stop him now." Before anyone could react, there was a sharp sound, a gunshot. Thompson lunged to the side, but the bullet grazed his shoulder, sending him to the ground with a grunt of pain. Emily's breath caught in her throat. This was it. It was happening faster than she had anticipated. "Go!" Rachel shouted, shoving Emily toward the side door. "Get out of here, Emily! You're not safe." But Emily couldn't move. She couldn't leave Thompson behind. He had helped them so much, and now he was injured. She ran to him, her heart pounding, but the man was already moving in, his gun raised. "Get back!" he shouted, and Emily felt herself freeze. She knew this wasn't a drill. This wasn't just a fight for her mother's freedom. It was a fight for their lives. Just then, a loud noise erupted from the hallway. A figure appeared in the doorway, Detective Mason. His gun was drawn, and his eyes locked on the man in front of them. "Let her go," Mason ordered, his voice cold and unyielding. "Or I'll make sure you regret it." The standoff lasted mere seconds. The man hesitated, but it was enough. In a swift motion, Mason fired, the bullet hitting its target. The man crumpled to the floor, motionless. The courtroom erupted into chaos as Mason rushed over to Thompson, pulling him to safety. Rachel grabbed Emily's hand, leading her out of the room. The fight wasn't over yet, but this was the break they needed. The hallway outside the courtroom was chaos. The sound of sirens filled the air, and the tension was thick, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Emily's heart was still racing, her mind replaying the gunshots and the split-second decisions that had saved their lives. Thompson was hurt, but he was alive, and that was all that mattered. Mason had acted fast. His timely intervention had shifted the odds in their favor, but it wasn't over yet. Callaway's men were still out there, and the real battle was just beginning. Emily's eyes darted nervously as she followed Rachel and Mason through the winding halls of the courthouse. Each turn felt like it might be their last. "Where are we going?" Emily asked, her voice shaky. She felt exhausted, as if the weight of the past few months had finally caught up with her. Her whole body felt drained, but she couldn't stop now. Not when they were so close. "Not far," Mason said. His voice was steady, but his eyes flicked around the corridor, constantly on alert. "We need to get to the press room. We have to get this out before Callaway can bury it again." Emily nodded, barely able to keep up with their pace. Her mind was still racing, processing everything that had happened, but it all seemed like a blur. The courtroom, the gunfire, Thompson being shot, and now the final push to expose Michael Callaway. When they reached the press room, the doors opened to a flood of reporters. The room was buzzing with activity, cameras flashing, microphones in the air, as reporters scrambled for the latest updates. But Rachel and Mason were prepared. They walked in with the evidence in hand, and the room fell silent. Emily stepped back, her eyes wide as she watched everything unfold. Rachel approached the podium, holding up the folder with the crucial documents. Mason stood beside her, his presence commanding. "We have proof," Rachel said, her voice strong. "Michael Callaway has been behind a web of corruption that stretches across our city. He's been involved in illegal activities, including the murder of Daniel Thompson, which was framed on an innocent woman, Jessica Carter. We've uncovered it all." The room was still. Then came the questions. They came fast and hard, reporters shouting over each other, trying to get the first scoop. But Rachel remained calm, answering every question with conviction. "We've handed the evidence to the authorities," she continued. "The police, the DA, they're already working on this. But we couldn't wait any longer. Callaway's people were already moving to silence us. We're putting it all out in the open." Emily couldn't believe it. After all the secrets, the lies, the fear, now the truth was finally out. They had done it. Callaway's empire was crumbling. No longer could he pull the strings, hiding behind his wealth and influence. The world would know what he had done, and he couldn't escape it. But as the reporters began to flood the room with more questions, Emily felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned around to see Detective Thompson, his face pale, but his expression determined. "I'll be fine," Thompson said, giving her a reassuring smile. "We need to stay focused. This isn't over yet." Emily nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. There was still work to do, She hadn't come this far just to watch it all unravel without fighting until the very end. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The media coverage was overwhelming. The police were raiding Callaway's properties, arresting his associates, and uncovering more of the illegal operations he had been running for years. The truth was out, and there was no going back for Callaway. The network he had built was falling apart, one piece at a time. As for Jessica, she was released from custody. The charges against her were dropped, and the court declared her innocent. It was a long, hard battle, but she was finally free. Emily and Jessica sat together in the living room of their new apartment, a place they had moved into after everything had settled down. It wasn't much, just a modest two-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood, but it felt like home. For the first time in a long time, Emily could breathe without looking over her shoulder. "How do you feel?" Emily asked, looking at her mother. Jessica smiled, a soft, bitter-sweet smile that spoke volumes. "It's strange," Jessica said, her voice quiet. "I never thought I'd get my life back. I didn't know if I'd ever be free again. But here we are, together." Emily nodded, her eyes bright with the weight of everything they had been through. "We did it," she said, her voice full of emotion. "We beat them." Jessica pulled her into a tight hug. "We did. And we'll keep fighting. But for now, let's just be together. It's over. We're safe." But as Emily rested her head against her mother's shoulder, something deep inside her told her that this was just the beginning. The system might have been shaken, but there would always be more to fight for. But for now, she was content. She was home. She had her mother back. And that was enough. Later that day, Emily sat by the window, looking out at the city as the sun began to set. The city, once a place of fear and danger, now felt like a place of hope. The darkness that had followed them for so long had finally receded. There was still work to do, but for now, they could rest. They had won. They had fought back. And together, they would face whatever came next.